Everyone believes that losing belly fat after 40 is a simple caloric problem. Yet a 2023 study in Cell Metabolism found that visceral fat in midlife adults resists caloric restriction at roughly half the rate it did at 28, and the mechanism behind that gap has been in the scientific literature since 2004. Your belly fat is not a willpower problem, it is a biology problem your doctor was never trained to solve. By minute 14 of this episode, you will have a complete picture of the exact mechanism, why the conventional eat less, move more advice fails to address it, and a specific 12-week protocol with dose ranges from controlled trials, not from influencer stacks. If you have been doing what you were told and your midsection still does not respond, this is where you finally see why. Here is the question that should be bothering you. If the science on visceral fat and insulin resistance has been published for 20 years, why does the advice you still hear in most clinics sound like 1994? Most adults in their 40s believe the belly fat problem is purely caloric. That is, the framing you got in school, from your GP, from almost every diet headline. Fewer calories in, more calories out, the fat goes away. And at 25, that actually worked for your body. You cut back, the scale moved, the waistline followed, and life continued. But something shifted, and if you are honest with yourself, you noticed it happening and quietly blamed age or discipline. It probably started in your late 30s, training sessions that no longer changed your shape the way they used to, a midsection that seemed to stabilize despite genuine effort, mornings where you felt heavier than the scale said you were. You were doing more and getting less. You assumed the failure was yours. There is a name for what happened, and it is not getting older. What happened in your body is a progressive deterioration of insulin sensitivity in visceral adipose tissue specifically. Not in your muscles first, not in your liver first, in the fat tissue surrounding your abdominal organs. And that distinction matters more than most practitioners acknowledge when they talk to you. A landmark framework published in Circulation in 2004 formalized something researchers had been circling for a decade. Visceral adipose tissue is not metabolically passive storage for your extra calories. It is an active endocrine organ. It produces inflammatory cytokines, interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, at a rate that scales with its volume. The larger your visceral depot, the more inflammatory signal it generates. And that signal feeds back into the very insulin pathways you would need to activate in order to reduce the depot. Your fat is not just sitting there, it is actively defending itself. I want to be honest about something here. When I first read the full Grundy framework, I had already been running a high-protein caloric restriction protocol on myself for about a year. My total weight dropped, my lab markers looked respectable, my visceral tape measure did not move in the way I expected. I assumed compliance failure. I logged harder. I restricted more. The tape still did not move. It was not your classic discipline problem. It was biology I did not understand yet. And I see that same pattern in almost every serious person who tries the same thing and blames themselves. Here is where the mechanism starts to matter for your actual day-to-day body. The core problem is not too much fat in an abstract sense. It is the location and the signaling environment of that fat. Visceral adipocytes, the fat cells around your internal organs, carry a higher density of cortisol receptors than your subcutaneous fat cells under the skin of your hips or thighs. That means that under conditions of chronic low-grade stress, which describes the lives of most 45-year-old professionals, visceral fat preferentially accumulates in your abdomen. Cortisol activates an enzyme inside that tissue, 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1, which regenerates active cortisol directly inside your fat cells from inactive cortisone. Your visceral fat is not just responding to the cortisol your adrenal glands release, it is manufacturing cortisol locally. That is why you can have a normal morning cortisol reading on your blood panel and still have a visceral fat depot behaving as if you live in permanent stress. The standard test is measuring cortisol in the wrong compartment. This is why your diet works everywhere except your stomach. Now, one layer deeper, because this is where the gap between the science and clinical practice becomes genuinely difficult to explain, and where you start to realize this is not about your lack of effort. A 2017 paper by Stefan and colleagues in Nature Reviews Endocrinology described what they called metabolically obese normal weight, a phenotype where people with a clinically normal BMI carry visceral fat depots large enough to drive systemic insulin resistance. The number in that study was not a rounding error. Roughly 22% of metabolically normal weight adults showed this visceral insulin pattern. Your GP is rarely screening for this. The standard metabolic panel does not capture it. If your fasting glucose and your BMI are both in range, most clinicians will tell you there is nothing to address. Roughly 1 in 5 normal weight adults is carrying this pattern without knowing it. If those data points stayed inside journals, the stakes for your life would be mostly academic. They are not academic. They are the difference between catching your metabolic drift now and waking up in 10 years with a diagnosis you thought came out of nowhere. This is not speculation. Here is the research. A 2022 meta-analysis in Obesity Reviews pooled data from 31 studies across 4 continents and found that visceral fat volume predicted cardiovascular events and type 2 diabetes onset independently of BMI, total body fat percentage, and fasting glucose, 3 of the 4 markers most commonly used to reassure you that you are fine. The predictive gap was largest in midlife adults, particularly in the 40 to 60 range. The authors noted explicitly that current screening tools were not designed to catch this phenotype, and recommended waist to height ratio as the most accessible proxy, not just waist circumference, the ratio. That is a calculation you can do in 60 seconds with a tape measure and your height, and almost no one in primary care is using it. If you have stayed with me this far, here is what you have earned access to next. The specific protocol, what you can actually do with this information, the interventions with the strongest evidence, and a realistic timeline of how your visceral fat is likely to respond. But before we build the stack, I want you to hold one sentence clearly. You now understand that visceral fat is an endocrine organ that locally regenerates cortisol, produces inflammatory signals that block its own breakdown, and remains almost completely invisible to the blood work you have been told is normal. That is the mechanism. The protocol follows directly from it. The physiological problem you are facing has 3 components: local cortisol excess inside visceral tissue, chronic low-grade inflammation from that tissue, and impaired insulin signaling in the visceral adipocytes specifically. An effective protocol has to address all 3. Caloric restriction alone targets none of them at the root. This is the consensus lag. The science has named these components clearly since around 2004. The recommendation to eat less and move more is aimed at a different problem entirely. Component 1 is insulin sensitivity in the visceral tissue itself. The intervention with the largest effect size here is not a pill. It is a specific way of moving your body. Zone 2 aerobic training, sustained moderate intensity work at roughly 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate, has been shown in multiple controlled trials to selectively reduce visceral adipose volume, even when your total body weight does not change. A 2012 study by Irving and colleagues in the American Journal of Physiology showed that low-intensity endurance training reduced visceral fat by about 18% over 12 weeks in postmenopausal women without dietary change. The mechanism there runs through AMPK, the AMP-activated protein kinase inside your cells, which improves insulin sensitivity in visceral adipocytes via a pathway that does not require you to be in a strict caloric deficit. Translated into non-lab terms, 4 to 5 sessions per week of around 45 minutes at a pace where you can still hold a conversation. Not gasping, not comfortable, that slightly uncomfortable sustainable middle, sustained for 12 weeks, is enough to produce a measurable reduction in your visceral fat. Component 2 is the local cortisol loop. The most evidence-backed nutritional intervention for 11-beta-HSD1 activity right now is licorice root extract at a dose of roughly 300 to 400 milligrams of glyceric acid per day, as documented in a 2003 paper in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. That enzyme inhibition is not theoretical, it is measurable, and it appears to be particularly relevant in visceral tissue. The data here are suggestive but not yet definitive for long-term visceral fat reduction as a standalone outcome, so this is not a magic bullet. It is one lever in a stack. The caution matters for your body. Licorice at higher doses and over long periods can raise blood pressure and alter your systemic cortisol balance. This is not a compound you stay on indefinitely without monitoring. The evidence-supported window is about 2 to 3 months at that dose, alongside regular blood pressure checks and a clear plan to taper. If you bring this to your physician as a patient who understands the mechanism and the monitoring requirements, the conversation you have will be very different from, "I saw a supplement on the internet." Component 3 is the chronic inflammation driven by your visceral fat's cytokine output. The interventions with the best evidence to risk ratio here are unglamorous. 2 to 3 grams per day of EPA plus DHA, the actual omega-3 fatty acids, not fish oil as a marketing phrase, repeatedly show reductions in inflammatory cytokines across a range of trials, as summarized in a 2020 Cochrane review. And time-restricted eating in a 10 to 12-hour window, aligned with your light-dark cycle, reduces post-meal inflammatory load without requiring caloric restriction. The window is important because the benefit appears to be circadian, not just about cutting out late-night snacks. A recent cell metabolism trial showed that a 10-hour daytime eating window produced a measurable reduction in visceral fat at 12 weeks, without any change in total calories compared to a control group eating over a 14-hour window. The effect size was modest, around a 5% reduction in visceral volume. But remember, this is a different mechanism than the Zone 2 intervention, which means the effects stack rather than duplicate. When you put these mechanisms together, you get a 12-week protocol that is a lot more precise than eat clean and exercise more. 4 or 5 Zone 2 sessions each week at a conversational pace for about 45 minutes at a time. A 10 to 12-hour eating window anchored to daylight, for example, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. in your local day. 2 to 3 grams per day of EPA plus DHA, whether from carefully chosen whole fish or from a verified supplement. And if your blood pressure is stable and your physician agrees, licorice root extract at the studied glyceric acid dose for 8 to 12 weeks with regular checks. Based on the aggregated evidence, the realistic expectation for your body at 12 weeks is a visceral fat reduction on the order of 15 to 25% if you begin with a meaningful visceral depot. That does not necessarily mean a dramatic change on your scale. Your total weight may shift very little. What changes is the tissue that most strongly predicts your cardiovascular and metabolic risk, the fat wrapped around your organs. You will see more change on a tape measure and, over time, on imaging than you see in your bathroom mirror on day 14. You now understand something that most people who have been fighting their midsection for years do not: that your visceral fat has its own local biology, that it runs its own cortisol factory, that it broadcasts inflammatory signals that block its own breakdown, and that the protocol that actually addresses it has to target that biology directly instead of punishing you for not trying hard enough. What I have shown you today is not the edge of what is known, it is closer to the center of it. In the next episode, I want to show you the liver side of this story. Your liver's ability to clear the inflammatory cytokines that your visceral fat produces depends heavily on a single enzyme pathway, and there is a dietary pattern, not a supplement, that suppresses that enzyme by roughly 40% within a few weeks. If your visceral fat is responding more slowly than the studies predict, that bottleneck is almost certainly why, and it is something you can address. How long have you been following the standard advice on belly fat? And what actually happened in your body when you did? And before we close, I want to make this very practical. If you are watching this and thinking, I do not know whether I actually have visceral fat, do not start with fear, start with measurement. The simplest proxy is your waist to height ratio. Measure your waist at the level of your navel, not where your pants sit. Then divide that number by your height using the same unit. If that ratio is above roughly 0.5, your body is giving you a signal worth taking seriously. That does not diagnose disease, it does not replace imaging, but it is one of the fastest ways to stop guessing. And this is where the psychology changes. You stop looking at your belly as a cosmetic failure, and you start looking at it as a metabolic signal. That shift matters because shame makes people either overreact or give up. Measurement gives you something else. It gives you a map. The goal is not to punish your body until the mirror changes. The goal is to change the internal environment that made this fat resistant in the first place. There is one more reason this matters. Visceral fat rarely travels alone. It usually appears beside poor sleep, rising blood pressure, lower morning energy, higher cravings at night, and that strange feeling that your body no longer responds to the rules that used to work. These are not separate stories. They are different windows into the same system. Your fat tissue speaks to your liver speaks to your blood sugar, your sleep speaks to your cortisol rhythm speaks back into your visceral tissue. This is not a straight line, it is a loop. That is why one heroic diet rarely works. A 12-week protocol works when it changes the loop from several angles at once. Movement that restores insulin sensitivity, timing that respects circadian biology, nutrients that lower inflammatory tone, and monitoring that keeps you honest without turning your life into a prison. You are not trying to win a weekend. You are trying to change the signal your body has been hearing for years. So here's the final frame I want you to hold. If your waist has become harder to change after 40, your body is not broken, it is adapted. It has adapted to stress, sleep debt, insulin pressure, inflammation, and years of metabolic signals that trained visceral fat to stay exactly where it is. The good news is that adaptation can move in both directions. You do not need a perfect body, you need a better signal. And if you give your body that signal consistently for 12 weeks, the tissue that felt immovable may finally begin to respond. The next episode goes one layer deeper, into the liver, because visceral fat sends the inflammatory message, but the liver decides how much of that message stays in circulation. That is where many people get stuck. So I want you to answer one question below. When you tried to lose belly fat after 40, what changed first? The scale, your waist, your energy, or nothing at all?